Hey everyone, welcome to WittCode, where in this video we're going to create a node login and signup system using Express, Sessions, and Bcrypt. So before we start coding, let me just give you a small demonstration of what we're going to build. And so it's going to be this simple form here, where we take a username and a password to log in. This is the code over here. And so at first when we have 0 users, as you can see registered users here is an empty array. If we say try to log in as WittCode and password, we will get invalid username or password. We can see the post data provided here. But now if we want to sign up, say we click here, we're on the sign up page now. Say we want to sign up as WittCode with the password, we sign up. Now we're on our profile page that says welcome WittCode. We can see some session information that we'll go over in this video. We can see the username WittCode and the password has been hashed with Bcrypt. And because what we've also done is set a session on here. So if I open up the console here, go into application, we can see a session that we've set right here. And this session is what keeps us logged in, even when we refresh the page. So say we refresh the page, we're still logged in, or we go to, say, back to the -login page. Because we have a session set, it'll redirect us to our profile page. Of course, when we log out, we'll be logged out. So now if we try and access the profile page like this, we'll be redirected back to login. We can log in now as WittCode, but if we say do the wrong password, we get invalid username or password. So let's log in with the correct one now. And we've logged in. And then one more thing I just want to show you is because we are hashing and salting passwords, say we create another user called, go to the sign up page. Let's create user 2. Let's make their password also to be password. If we sign them up, now we have welcome user 2. We can see, even though both passwords are the string password, they are stored as a different unique hash. And of course, this is for security reasons, but we'll go over all of this in this video. All right, so let's start coding now. And to do that, I'm just going to open up a new window. Then let's create a new project. I'm just going to create it on a desktop, call it node login system, and let's open it. And now let's just initially, let me zoom in. And to begin, let's set up our project structure and install some necessary dependencies. So the first thing I'm going to do is initialize this project with npm init es6-y. This will create a package.json file with es6 syntax. Now let's install nodemon as a development dependency. Of course, we'll use this to automatically update our code as we're going along. And now let's install both Express and Bcrypt, just like this. And so, of course, Express will create a server to handle user requests, and we'll use Bcrypt to hash the passwords that we receive. And now let's set up our project to use sessions. And so real quick, a session is a series of requests that come from the same client during a given time period. The reason we need sessions is because websites use the HTTP protocol, which is stateless. This means that after each request and response, the client and server forget everything about one another. And if we want the client and server to remember one another, we can use a session. So there are other ways to do it, but we're going to be using a session cookie. And so sessions contain data about the client, allowing the server to keep track of the user. Specifically, the session could be stored as a cookie on the user's browser. With every request, they send that cookie. That cookie contains a session ID, which the server then looks up, and that ID is linked to the user's information. But we'll go over this more as we start coding it. But to work with sessions in Express, we need to use the package express session. So we'll install express session like this. And so what this library does is it creates a session middleware to handle sessions in Express. And this includes creating the session, setting the session cookie, and setting the session object on the request object. And now for the simple HTML files that you saw with that ugly login form, we're going to be making that stuff with a template engine called Pug. So install Pug, which is just PUG. And so what template engines are is they basically allow us to use template files with dynamic content. So as you saw on our profile page, when we were on a specific user's profile, it showed that user's username. We can do that by using template engines like this one, Pug. All right, but so we've got our necessary dependencies all installed. The next thing we'll do is let's create a source directory. And this, of course, will hold our source code. And within here, let's create another folder called services. And in here, we're going to create a class called Express Service. And of course, it needs to be a JavaScript file. And so I'm going to be doing stuff in classes. Of course, you don't have to, but I just like to do that to just separate out the logic. But to begin, let's just import Express here. So all our code here in the Express service is going to be related to Express. And we're just going to export default a class called express service. And actually let me copy and paste some code in here that I already have set up. So let me close this down. So first what we do is we have an app instance, which is an express app. Next we have a secret here, which this secret, it's a static property of this class. It will be used to sign our session cookie. And essentially what this means is it will be used to check if the session has been tampered with. So say the user has access to the cookie in their browser and they tamper the cookie and send it back up. We can check this by using this secret. Next we have a port, which is the port that our server is running on, and a node environment variable just to check if we are in either development or production mode. Then we have just our simple constructor. And so when an instance of this class is created, we're just going to create an express app. And now after this, let's create a method called initialize. And what this will do is it will bootstrap our express application with all the necessary middleware. So the first middleware that we'll set up is our static content. And this will be used to serve up static files such as images, CSS, and JavaScript. So in our example, our login form was styled with CSS from a CSS file, and that comes from a CSS file served up by the library called express.static. So this line here now means that Express will serve up static content from the public folder. And let's actually create this public folder at the top level. So it's just going to be called public like this. And also we don't have this path imported. So just import path like this. All right, so now we have our static files set up. Next middleware we will set up is our view engine. And so remember, we are using the view engine pug. And to set up pug, you actually use this method for an express app, which is set. So down here, we have these two lines, which allows us to use our pug view engine. And this set method is what it's used for is to store variables. So for example, it's often used with the method get to retrieve the stored variable. So say we have, just as a quick example, say we had app.set favechannel to be WittCode. If we then used app.get favechannel, this would return the string WittCode. However, there are also certain names for this set method that are used for configuration. For example, this key view engine is reserved for setting the Express application's view engine, which for us is pug. And then we are going to serve up these templates from a directory called views, which we also will create the top level called views. So we have public for our static content and views for our templates. And now we want to be able to handle JSON payloads in our Express server, because basically Express is just an empty server and you need to add all this middleware to give it more functionality. And to do this, we're going to be using two middlewares, which once again I'm just going to paste in here. And they are express.json and express.urlencoded. So the express.json middleware here parses requests where the content type header is application.json. So if it receives a request where the content type header is application.json, what it'll do, it'll add the payload from that request to the body property of the express request object. So you know when you have something like app.get and then like this request response, it adds the payload to this request object. If there is no body to parse or the content type was not matched, so it was an application.json or an error occurred, then the property rec.body, so in here it'll be rec.body, will be an empty object. Next, this express.urlencoded middleware parses requests where the content type header is application-x www form URL encoded. So the payload is basically in a form URL encoded format. And it also accepts a configuration object, and one of these configuration options is extended. And setting this extended to true allows for objects and arrays to be encoded in the URL encoded format. And this makes working with URL encoded data similar to working with JSON. So now we've got that set up, let's work on creating the session. So let's create our session using the Express session middleware. And so first what we need to do is just import this at the top. I'm going to import it as the word session from Express session. And now we're going to configure it as global middleware like we have with the others by using app.use. And I'm just going to paste it in right here. So what we've basically done is we've created a session with the name mySessionID. And we'll be able to see this in the browser later on. Don't worry, I'll show you all this. Next we're going to configure the cookie. So this is the cookie that's set on the browser that holds the session ID. And something we set is HTTP only, and this is so that the cookie can't be accessed through JavaScript on the client, such as using document.cookie. We also have this secure true, which we're not going to set to true in here because we're working on localhost on HTTP, but in production you should set it to true so that this cookie is only sent over HTTPS. And there are a few other options you could add, but for demonstration purposes, this works fine. And then next we have our secret, which of course is used to sign our session cookie and check if it's been tampered with. Then we have the option resave, and setting this to true basically forces the session to be saved back to the session store, even if it was never modified during the request. So under the hood, this session middleware, express session, will be storing all of our sessions in memory. And this is fine for development, but in production, of course, you'd want to store them somewhere else, like Redis or MongoDB or Postgres, just in some kind of database. But in this demonstration, we're simply just going to be saving these to memory, which I'll show you more later. And then next we have save uninitialized, and setting this to true will save an uninitialized session to the store. And basically a session is uninitialized if it is new but not modified. So essentially right when the session is created, it'll be saved to the session store. So now, because of this middleware here, when we receive requests from a client, they will have a cookie set on them with a session ID called mySessionID. And this session ID will then be used to identify the user. So the session ID won't be this, it'll be some kind of string, but each of those strings will be unique to each session, and we'll be able to use them to identify the user. But the express session middleware will basically be doing all this for us under the hood, but more on that later. And now after this initialize method, I'm going to minimize this. Let's just create another one called add logging middleware. And so this method here, I'm just going to paste in like this. What this is going to do is just add some simple logging to our server. So on every request, this code will log out the request method, the path and the body of the request, as well as the current registered users to the application. And this authService.users is another class that we'll create that we haven't created yet, but we'll do that later on. And now let's add a simple authorization middleware, and we're going to do that inside another method called add authorization middleware. So down here, we have add authorization middleware. And so what this will do is it'll check if the current session contains a username. So we see rec.session.username, and if it does, then the request is allowed to proceed. And we do this by saying return next. And if the request session doesn't have a username, then that means that the request isn't authorized, and we will redirect them to the login page. So this username property on the request.session, which the express session middleware creates this session object, but we are going to append this username property onto it by ourselves, either when a user logs in or signs up. So now let's handle logging a user in. So I'm going to minimize this now, and we're going to have another middleware. I'm going to call it actually, or I'm just going to copy and paste this, but it's going to be called add login routes. So essentially what this does is we will have a get and a post method to the route-login. And the first one is, of course, handles get requests to -login. And what it does is it checks if there's a username on the session, and if there is, we redirect them to their profile page, and if not, we just render the login page. And then we have this post route here, which is going to handle the username and password payload from the request. And then we're going to have this method called login, which we'll create soon, which basically will log the user in. And if a user is returned or not returned, then it'll say login invalid username and password, which basically means invalid password or user doesn't exist. And if not, we're going to set the username of the session and redirect them to the profile. And after this line has been done here, of course, this is when they'll be able to pass the authorization middleware check, because this will be true because we've set the username right here. But so now, before we go on, let's create this login method. And we're actually going to do this, so handle all our authorization in a separate class called authService.js. And for here, let me just import some more code. So here is the login method that we are going to be using inside our login route where we handle post requests. And the reason we can use this .login is because our express service is going to extend this auth service. And what this essentially means is we can use the public or protected methods that we create in here. And by default, if we don't say private or protected, this will just be public. But so what we do in here is we first import Bcrypt, our password hashing library. Then we create our auth service class and an asynchronous login method. So what this login method does is it will look for a user inside this users array, which is a static variable, and it'll return a user where the provided username, which is provided to this function, is equal or exists in this array. So if we find a user in this array with the provided username, then we get them here. If there wasn't one found, then that user doesn't exist and we return undefined. Whereas if they do, we use Bcrypt to compare the password that the user provided with the password we have stored, which will be a hashed password. So basically Bcrypt will be able to compare a plain string password, say we type in password here, to a hash of the password, which will be a big mix of characters, which back in here, it'll essentially compare this here to this here and see if it's valid. And if it is, then the user is verified and we return them. If they're not, then we return undefined. And if we go to where we're calling this, this is where if undefined is returned from this login function or method, then we will render the login page with invalid username or password. If not, we redirect them to the profile. And something we forgot to do actually in here is when we are extending a class, we need to call the superclass's constructor by calling the keyword super. But so this is actually all we need to do for logging the user in. Now we need to handle some signup. And similar to login, we're going to have something called add signup routes. So we have add login routes, and now we have add signup routes. And so this handles the route -signup, and we have a get request there and a post request. And of course, once again here, if we try and access the signup route with an authorized session containing the username property, then we will redirect them to the profile. If not, we send them to the signup page. And then we have to handle the payload, the request body, we have username, password, and this signup method. And so let's create this signup method now. And you might have guessed this is also going to be in our auth service because it involves authentication and authorization. And so what it accepts is a username, password. Once again, what we're going to do is we're going to check to see if that user already exists. Because if they do, we're not going to sign up a user with that username. So we'll return undefined. But if that user doesn't exist, then we're going to generate a salt and hash the password with the salt using Bcrypt. So we generate a salt using something called salt rounds and then hash it with bcrypt.hash. And then we create a user with the username, the password set to the hash password, and we add that user to our auth service users and then return the user. And now before we continue, let me go over this line stuff here about salting and hashing passwords. So we're going to go a little depth into password security. So passwords need to be stored such that even if the database was breached by a hacker, the hacker would have a hard time using the passwords. And to do this, the actual password values should not be stored in the database, but rather a hash of the password. And that is what we saw here. These are all hashes as opposed to the plain text password. And the reason we do this is not only to protect passwords from hackers, but also from anyone who has access to the database. And this includes developers. And this is why we're storing the hash password inside the users array, so this hash password, and not the plain text password. And so what a hash is, so a hash is the result of input being passed through a hash function. And hashes are the best way to store passwords as they cannot be reverted back to their original values. So therefore, if a hacker accessed a database of hash passwords, they wouldn't be able to decrypt them. Rather, they would have to pass random passwords through a hash function to try and match one of the hashes stored in the database. However, storing the hash alone is not enough, because what we did here is we also use a salt. And what a salt is it's a unique randomly generated string that we add to each password. So we hash the password with a salt. And the reason we do this is because it increases security, because now we'll have a unique hash for every password, even if the passwords are the same. So essentially, using this salt will make it so hashing the string password isn't the same hash every single time. And then finally, just these salt rounds are essentially the higher the salt rounds, the more secure the password is, but also the more CPU, GPU heavy the operation will be on the system. And so we just chose, actually we haven't put it in yet, but we are doing a value of 12, so 12 salt rounds. Okay, so now that we've gone over hashing and salting, let's add some protected routes to our Express server. So basically all the login routes and signup routes aren't protected by this authorization middleware because these are essentially used to be able to pass this authorization middleware because we don't need to have someone logged in to access the login or signup pages. But now we're going to add some routes that are protected by an authenticated session. And this, of course, will be our profile page and also our logout route, so to log the user out. And we're going to do this inside add protected routes. And all this will do is render our profile page with the user's username, and then logout will destroy the session, which basically means erase it from memory, and then redirect the user to the login page. After the session has been destroyed, then the rec.session.username property is no longer set. So if they try and access the profile route, they will get rejected by this authorization check here. So now that we've got this done, let's start our Express server. And I'm going to do this inside a method called listen. So just like Express uses, we're going to have listen. So, and the order that we provide everything here matters. So first we want to initialize our server, which means add all our global middleware. Then we're going to add our login middleware, or logging, then our login and sign up, and then our authorization middleware. And it needs to be placed before our protected routes, because if we place this after, then they won't be protected by this middleware, because in Express middleware, basically the order matters, and the order you place them in is the order they will be run. And now let's just, at our top level of our source folder, let's create a server.js file. And we're just going to now create an instance of our Express service class, just like this, and then call the listen method. And now our server will be set up. But so that's basically all the logic to this. Now we're just going to create the HTML or the views and the CSS files. And I'm not going to spend too much time going over this, but essentially I'll give a rundown. But our first one is going to be a template, and it's going to be our signup template, which we'll call signup.pug. And all this will be, you might have guessed, I'm just going to copy and paste this as well. But all this will be is just our signup form. So we can see we have a class for a container, or I think this is an ID in Pug. We have our form that sends a post request to our signup route. We have our input for our username, input for our password, and then this here is an anchor tag that'll move us to the login page. And this right here creates a style sheet for login.css, which will be served up from this public folder by our Express server. And now we have a signup view. We also have a login one, so login.pug. And once again, I'm going to do some copy paste magic. And in this is basically the same as the signup form, except we are sending a post request to -login instead. And our anchor tag will take us to the signup page at the bottom, where it says not registered sign up, whereas here it said already user login. And then I think this is our final view, is we also had a profile one. So if we do profile.pug, and this is a lot less markup here. So all it will say is user's profile in the title, welcome to the username, and then an anchor tag that will call our -logout route. And so welcome, the way this username is populated with like the username WittCode and so on is by, in our Express service, when we render the profile, which will be profile.pug, it'll provide this username variable, and that will be filled in right here. So it'll say welcome WittCode. And now let's just create our CSS. So both our sign in and login form use login.css, and we'll create that in here. We'll just call it login.css. And of course, this is just going to be used to style our login sign up forms. So we can see we're doing a global reset for setting just the font family to whatever this is. Then we have our body. We're basically making this full page, making the body the full view of the page, setting everything to display flex. And then we're doing this container to center things. Same with our form. We're adding some background color and some heights and widths. And then we're styling our inputs. So we're styling our submit button here, and then inputs that are not of the type submit here, which I believe would be like our text fields for the username and password. But so this was actually everything to this. So all we need to do is create a start script to run the application. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create one in here called start, and I'm going to create a variable here called environment variable called port. I'm going to set that equal to 4000, and then I'm just going to run nodemon. I'm going to run nodemon with a dot like this, and this dot essentially means whatever's in main, which is index.js here, but for us it'll be dot-source-server.js. And note that so this sets the port environment variable, which of course is called or set here for processing env.port. We also need to set our node environment and our secret. So I'm going to do node env development, and then also secrets. What they should be is in production they should be really long, long, complicated strings that you cannot easily guess, and they should also be rotated periodically. But for this, I'm just going to type in some garbage like that. And also, one other thing to note is you can set environment variables like this on Unix, so like in Mac and Linux, but you cannot do this in Windows. In Windows, you might have to install some separate npm script, but it should be pretty straightforward. And then you can set the environment variables, or of course, you could just set them directly here. But so this is it. So now all we need to do is hope that everything we did works. So we'll run npm start, and we get cannot find module auth service. And this will probably be because we didn't do authservice.js. And now we have address already in use. And this will actually probably be because I've used, I was testing this out earlier. So let's just do something random. Let's do 4055, and then we'll have to run this again. So now our server is running on port 455. So let's open that up in a browser. And I'm going to make sure to use an incognito window for this. And so it was localhost 4055. And we'll go to the login page. Sweet. And so when we're here, we can see we have no registered users. We can see a get request to the login form with an empty request body, and so on. And now let's try and log in as WittCode. Do a password, invalid username. So let's try and sign up with WittCode with password. We're signed up. Sweet. And we can see our session ID here. We can see our username and password. And then we can see some information about the cookie, such as HTTP only, set to false, which I think we did inside here, inside initialize. We have it set to false. I think we should also actually just set this to true. In development, it doesn't matter too much, but out in production, I would recommend setting this to true. And now something important, let's check our application here. So let's look at our cookies. And so for localhost here, let me zoom in. We can see our session cookie here. So we can see this is the ID. This is the name my session ID. HTTP only is checked. This is all coming from this middleware here. So we can see we have the name my session ID, which is right here. We have HTTP only set to true, which we can see reflected by HTTP only with a check mark. And then we have our value, which is this right here, which is basically will be sent up to our Express server. And then our Express session, what that middleware will do is it'll handle this session for us, provide us back the correct session. And we can use things like check if the session has a username, and if they do, send them to the profile page and things like that. But let's go back to here. Now let's try logging in as WittCode. So we'll do WittCode, password, and we get invalid username and password. And the reason is because everything is stored in memory at the moment. So whenever we make a change and refresh, of course, our registered users will all be wiped away. So we'd have to sign up again. But basically, this is how you can make a login and sign up system with Node using Express sessions and Bcrypt. Thank you for liking and subscribing today. If you want to support me more, please consider downloading my Chrome extension called Witceptor. Link is in the description. Besides that, if you have any questions, leave them in the comments, and hope to see you in the next one. Have a good one.